Well, thank you all for joining us here today. We had a joint effort between our iScore RC and our clinical trials toolkit here at the Center of Excellence. So with that, you are coming here to talk to Leslie Sam. She's going to talk to us about ICH E6. But before we do that, this was sponsored by our West Virginia local chapter. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to the president of that chapter, which is Shelley Welch.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome for those in the room. I hope you have enjoyed the food. And the West Virginia chapter is always open to new members. If you would like to join our chapter, we're a small chapter and we cover all of West Virginia because we're relatively small in our state. And so enjoy the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Shelley. As you all know, I always have a couple administrative things to go over. We are able to offer ACRP credit today. So if you are someone that is credited through ACRP, if you can very clearly write ACRP in your in the chat box and put your email, we would greatly appreciate it. We are also still able to offer continuing education credit. So if you put CE, I'll get that form over to you, myself or Kylie. And then of course, Ms. Sam also provided is allowing us to share her slides today as well. So if you are a SOCRA member, because I saw one or two of you on there, I know who you are now. We will get that sign-in sheet and those slides over for potential credit through SOCRA. We are going to take questions at the end, so please feel free to add your questions in, and Kylie and myself will facilitate that at the end. All right, I think that's all my admin stuff. Okay, so with that, Leslie Sam is the president of Leslie Sam and Associates, which is an LLC, which brings over 25 years of expertise in clinical trial research, quality management, and leadership roles. As a Six Sigma Black Belt, Leslie drives transformative solutions in the design and implementation of clinical quality management systems, with a strong focus on cultivating a culture of quality at every level. Her strategic approaches seamlessly integrate regulatory guidance and industry-leading practices, enabling organizations to adopt risk-based quality management and other forward-thinking practices in clinical trial execution. Leslie's expertise is recognized across the industry. She led the ACRP webinar, Crack the Code, a comparison of ICH E6R2 and ICH E6R3, providing insights on the latest regulatory updates. From 2015 to 2017, she was sought by Trans-Celerate Biopharm to co-develop and co-author conceptual frameworks for CQMS, and issue management, contributing significantly to industry standards. Her ability to apply both strategic and tactical risk-based approaches has been instrumental in maintaining data integrity, patient safety, and regulatory compliance in clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Leslie to go ahead and start our presentation on ICH E6.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and I appreciate the warm welcome and the invitation to come to speak with you all today. I'm really excited to share with you some of the observations that I've made with regard to ICH E6R3, the results and outcomes of some of my conversations that I've had about with other quality colleagues and clinical operations colleagues, both at sponsors and sites and CROs, as well as the regulatory authorities as well. So I'm happy to share with you some of the insights that I've learned over the course of the next 55 minutes or so. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm here today to share with you from rules to reality. How do you turn ICH E6R3 into something that works for you, a practical application with real world impact? So as Debbie said, I'm Leslie Sam, and you guys have heard all about me. And I will just also add, I love what I do. I love what I do. I love making a difference in how drugs are developed. The quality of the research is just one of my many passions. So I'm glad I get to spend some time with you all today. So today we're going to start with an agenda that includes looking at some of the key changes and their impact on you as clinical investigators, site personnel, and staff and leaders. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive and hopefully broaden your understanding about risk-based approaches. So if you've had the time to review R3, and that's what I'm just going to refer to it from this point on, you'll see that there's a lot of conversation, or a lot of discussion and narrative about using risk-based thinking, using risk-based approaches, applying risk-based methodologies all throughout. So we will cover a little bit of that and share some insights with you on that perspective. And then, of course, include real-world examples. So first, I have a question for you. A quick one. And we're just going to use, you can use chat, you can put up a little emoticon or something like that here in Zoom. But the question I have for you, what's the most important part of good clinical practice at the investigator site? And I want you to choose one. Is it protecting the participants' rights and safety, well-being, and so on? Is it ensuring accurate and reliable data? How about, is it following the protocol and the regulatory requirements? Is that the most important part of the GCP? Or is it proper delegation and oversight of tasks? Or are you just not sure and you're here to learn more? And any one that you choose, it's okay. I'm just here to ask the question to get an understanding of where you are in your current understanding. Take a moment and think about it. Okay, so I see we have a range of responses here. And if you chose anything, it's the right answer. This was not a trick. It was the right answer if you chose anything, okay? Because really, the GCPs, they're all about protecting participants, right? And having good, reliable data with following the compliance, right? Following the compliance guidelines that are described in the requirements we have. Proper delegation and oversight and responsibility of tasks, all of those play a role in the GCPs and what we're all accountable for. So if you answered anything, you got the right answer. Thank you. So let's dive in. Let's start with first the structure. So for those of you that are familiar with R2 and became like me very comfortable with what it said and how it was laid out, there's been some changes to the structure. I was very familiar with the investigator site section that said, in section 4, and all the responsibilities and accountabilities that were described there. And in section 5, the sponsor responsibilities. In section 6, the protocol. I was very familiar. So they kind of mix things up a bit here. So what this diagram shows you is that R3 is now comprised of different components. Annex 1 are those considerations for interventional clinical trials. So beginning, what you're probably most familiar with, it includes the responsibilities for the IRBs and ethics committees, the investigators and sponsors, but it has something new in Annex 1, the data governance in Section 4. Data governance, and it's not data governance specific to the investigator or specific to the sponsor, it's data governance across both, and they call them responsible parties, as you'll see if you haven't had a chance. Then there's the appendices here that is also described in R3. And this is where some of what was formerly the IRR investigators brochure section, that's now in Appendix A. The protocol and protocol development, protocol amendments is in Appendix B. And then essential records, maybe what you capture in your site files, that's now described in Appendix C. And then we have a glossary. So the glossary used to be at the very beginning, now it's at the end. And of course, this is all kicked off by part 2. It's the principles at the beginning, okay? So this is the new structure in R3 that you'll find. And then I also need to let you know that Annex 2 is in draft. And there's conversations and development ongoing. And there was supposed to be a public workshop where FDA and Health Canada and I think MHRA were going to have a joint session workshop to go over the feedback and the comments for Annex 2, but it was postponed. So stay tuned, more to come on Annex 2, which will describe those additional consideration for interventional clinical trials, like your pragmatic trials or your DCTs, so your DCT type trials. So stay tuned. But this is the new structure. So what are some of the drivers? Why did we need to change R2? It seemed to be working fine for some of us, maybe, but there were some drivers. So there was a need to move from a one-size-fits-all GCP model to something that's more proportionate for oversight and documentation. So no longer the one-size-fits-all. There was a recognition and acknowledgement that that just doesn't work. Our clinical trials have different degrees of risk, and the way we conduct and oversee and document those clinical trials should be reflected based on the amount of risk. And I think we would all agree. We learned a lot during the pandemic, during COVID. And so a lot of those learnings have been incorporated here in R3. So they introduce greater flexibility. Another aspect is remote consent. You know, we all kind of grappled with that in the beginning, but now it's like the back of our hand. So they codified it and put some expectations and descriptions for requirements related to remote consent, decentralized trials, right? Again, where perhaps partially or in totality, participants don't come to the investigator site. What do the requirements look like for that? More to come, and more data-driven oversight, focused on the data that's critical to patient safety and critical to data reliability. Another key driver for the change was the GCP requirements that align with trial complexity and risk. So reducing unnecessary burden. Again, if you've had the chance to review R3, you'll see that theme over and over again, reducing unnecessary burden. So I thought I would just give you a couple of examples of what you might see here. So a big change. That might be in the form of, one of the new requirements is the investigators must review sponsor-provided electronic data in real time. This is something new. Maybe your sponsors that you're working with had this requirement, but now it's codified. They had the need for this to be included in the protocol because of the design, but now it's codified. And so that investigators must review sponsor-provided electronic data in real time. So that requires a process and training and updates. So I would say this may be a big change for some of you, maybe not for everyone, but I would say stay tuned and look for those partnerships and collaborations with your partners and your sponsors and other stakeholders to learn more, because they're figuring it out too. No one has all the answers. Let me just go on record. An example of a smaller change might be the delegation documentation. It's now risk-based. You'll find in R3 that in context it says some low-risk activities may not need to be formally tracked, okay? But again, that includes conversations with your sponsor and at the investigator site, right, to determine what do we consider a low-risk activity. Is it that the protocol requires a blood pressure as a part of, recording that for your participants in their files, right? If it's not a cardiovascular study, maybe that's just standard of care. But if it's a cardiovascular study, maybe there's a different degree of documentation and the delegation documentation that goes along with it. So you kind of have to make those judgment calls and critical thinking. It's not one size fits all now, everything is low risk. There really needs to be some conversation and understanding at the investigator site, looking at the qualifications and knowledge of the individuals completing the task, the assigned task, as well as with your sponsors. What are they looking for? So now I want to take you quickly through the new table of contents for the investigator section. So as I said earlier, the investigator section is captured in Annex 1, Section 2. And so let's quickly go through the table of contents, starting with Section 2.1. You have the qualifications and training. And then resources. Responsibilities is a new section, and we're going to cover a little bit of that in the coming slides. What does that responsibilities look like? What's new there? So that's a completely new section. We also have Section 2.4, communications with IRBs and ethics committees, compliance with the protocol, premature termination and suspension of the trial, followed by Section 2.7, participant medical care and safety reporting. Here in Section 2.8, informed consent of trial participants, another new section. So two new sections. The second one is Section 2.9, end of participation in the trial. In Section 2.10, investigational product management. 2.11, randomization procedures and unblinding, and 2.12 is records, and then 2.13 is reports. So this just kind of gives you an overview of what you'll find as you're reviewing Section 2 here for the investigator. And while I'm not going to be able to go into detail of all of the sections and maybe some of the nuances, because quite frankly, some of the changes were just to add more clarity. They weren't like big changes like what I described maybe on the previous slide and what I'm going to go over now. So let's start with site staff delegation. This was one of the one of the key topics that I saw here in the responsibility section. So oversight of delegated staff. So that's the site staff from the site's perspective. And so how does it affect the sites? The investigator retains ultimate responsibility for site staff. Now, I don't feel like that's new. It's probably not, but now it's codified and it's described, and it's always been that expectation. For the sites, it's required documented oversight, including the qualifications and training. Now, again, it's not one size fits all, so it depends on the tasks that have been delegated or assigned to the staff and what that oversight looks like and what the training might be as well. A risk-based approach to training and oversight is described here in R3. The investigator sites must apply a risk proportionate approach to oversight. So not all tasks require or need equal scrutiny. So for example, focusing the oversight on where it matters, maybe those tasks and activities, outcomes, activities, and so on that are related to participants' rights, safety, and well-being, as well as data reliability. So as you're considering R3 and what does it mean to you, you will want to perform an assessment. Look at your existing processes. Look at your existing procedures that you have at your investigator site to determine, are we complying with what's described in R3, or do we have some gaps? Do we need to change our process, improve our process, create a process? Where do you stand? And so what I've given you here are just a few questions as a starting point. As a starting point, as I say, not intended to be all encompassing. So as a starting point related to site staff delegation, you may ask yourself, do we have a documented delegation of authority log for the site staff? I can tell you that just recently I helped with the back room of an investigator site inspection, and they did not have one. So while many of you may be thinking, or several of you may be thinking, well, everyone has that. That's like 101 to good site practice, but not the case, right? So do you have good documented delegation of authority logs? Are the training and oversight proportionate? Is it documented? Can you describe what this proportionate approach looks like? Right size training, oversight, and it's based on the risk to the participants and the data reliability. How are we actively overseeing this task beyond basic documentation? Is someone actively reviewing? Is it see one, do one? Is it checking in and periodically reviewing? Right? So here, this, like I said, is just a few questions to get you started. So I thought it might help to give you a few more just for this one particular area. So site staff delegation. So here's some examples of other questions you might ask. Do we routinely review and update the delegation logs to reflect the changes in staff responsibilities? Sometimes this is a struggle. If you've got a big team or a big group, this can be a lot. Are delegated staff appropriately qualified and trained for all the tests that are assigned to them? So what you'll also see in R3, there's references to if an activity or task has been delegated and it's a part of their natural training, like if you're the study nurse, the site nurse, and you're trained to do nursing type tasks, do you need to have additional training to take the blood pressure? Well, maybe not if it's a part of the routine care for the patients, but maybe you'll need training if it's something specific for this cardiovascular system or protocol, right? So it just kind of, it's one of those situations where we use the language, it depends. It really depends in these circumstances of risk-based approaches. Critical thinking will serve you well. Some other questions you might ask yourself. How do we verify that delegated staff are following the protocol required procedures correctly? How do you verify that? Is it, someone's looking at the EDC output? Is someone looking at protocol deviations? Do you wait for your monitor to come and tell you? How are you doing that? Do we have a clear escalation process for issues arising from delegated tasks? A couple more questions. Are we using a risk-based approach to determine the level of oversight for the delegated task? How do we ensure the proper handoff and oversight when delegated tasks transition between staff? Again, these are just some example questions that you might ask yourselves as you're assessing, are we complying with the expectations that are described in R3 related to site staff delegation? I just thought I would get you started with a few more for this particular topic. So another change here in R3, as we're moving on, is a service provider delegation. Historically, this has been all about the sponsor and the sponsor responsibilities for vendor oversight, as it was previously called in R2, or those third parties and all the other names that we could come up to describe those contracted services that we've assigned to someone not a part of our organization. Well, R3 has come up with a new term and additional responsibilities that include the investigator site for service providers. So let's start with the definition. That's a service provider is a person or organization, that's whether it's commercial organization, academic or other, providing a service used by either the sponsor or the investigator to fulfill trial-related activities. Now, this definition comes directly from the glossary here that you'll find at the end of R3, okay? So let's take a look and see what it says about service provider delegation and responsibilities for the oversight, because this is something new. So a key change, oversight of service providers, whether it may be, for example, as they've included, imaging centers, ePro service providers or home health service providers or central labs, right? So how does this affect the investigator site? Investigators are now explicitly and ultimately responsible for service providers' compliance, even when it's contracted by the sponsors, right? So this is a signal that it's going to take a lot of partnership and maybe some collaboration and understanding of where one aspect of the contract begins, and the aspect of oversight begins, right? So how do you bring those two together? It's going to be a partnership. Another way that it affects the sites is it requires agreements, clarifying responsibilities, is what I was just alluding to. And then the risk-based approach, higher risk service providers, maybe if you have a service provider that's helping with safety monitoring, they maybe would need more oversight, right? So as you're looking at your assessment of your current processes, maybe you're using home health services in your study or your protocol that maybe you at the investigator site has contracted, right? Individually, separate from the sponsor. Do you have clear agreements in place defining the responsibilities for the service provider and how you are going to oversee their work? Are high-risk service provider activities monitored more closely than the routine task? Have you described what's routine and what's high risk? Is someone assessing whether the service providers are following the protocol requirements? Looking at human biological samples and the integrity. We're working with the same vendor and we've worked with them for a long time, but it seems like every once in a while that we have problems with the samples being delivered. They're not properly stored or properly managed in transit. What is that tied to? Is anyone noticing? Is anyone paying attention? How about safety monitoring? Are they following the protocol requirements if you have that at your site? So these are just some of the examples of questions you might ask yourself. And I'm sure all of you sitting here today can maybe come up with many, many other questions that will help you assess the performance of the service providers and how you might oversee their performance. But again, I would say you don't need to operate on an island when you're overseeing and managing and monitoring the service providers that you may contract. Look to your sponsors to help you determine what that oversight might be. So we have an activity. I want you all to consider scenario 1. Your site has a new study coordinator who will be performing these tasks in addition to many others. So task A, administering an investigational IV drug to a trial participant. That's one thing that this person has been assigned to do. And this person will also record the participant's weight and height at routine visits. So you're going to use chat to tell me which risk is higher. Is it A or is it B? If you could just quickly in chat tell me, which is it, A or is it B? Okay, looks like we're getting some responses. So some of you feel, I think most of you feel A is the higher risk. I would agree. I would agree. Study drug administration, not approved to a participant. I would agree. It's A. Routine, you know, you got a nurse coordinator, study coordinator, and I didn't necessarily say it was a nurse, but generally it's or you're medically trained, but generally that's who that assignment A would be delegated to. But yeah, I agree. So with A. So I have another question for you. Give me some examples of how you might train and oversee the study coordinator. And let's just pick one of the tasks for task A. How might you train and pick one? How might you train? And then some of you tell me how might you oversee the performance of the study coordinator's performance of task A? How might you train them? In chat, if you just want to give me a quick note, I'd appreciate it. How might you train them? I'm not seeing answers come up. Am I delayed? Okay, there we go. Okay, it's probably just delayed. So the sponsor provide the training and we can practice before the study starts. That's a great idea for the training. Great idea. And you know, we use that all the time when I worked at a sponsor. Ensure that they're credentialed to deliver IV products and review pharmacy manual and documentation. Julia, that is a fantastic idea. That's great. So it's not like rocket science. It's what you would normally do in your practice. But now we just need to document it and be thoughtful about who we're assigning and delegating tasks to and how we're going to oversee it, right? So let's get back to the presentation. Thank you for those of you who've responded. We need to keep moving on. I have another example for you though, before we get back to the task at hand. So scenario number 2, your site is working with 2 different service providers. We've got one that's a mobile ECG technician that visits the site to perform scheduled ECGs. And then we've got another service provider that's a temperature controlled courier service, and they pick up and deliver IP from the pharmacy and to the site for dosing. Okay, so question. Which task is higher risk? Do you think it's A or do you think it's B? If you want to quickly tell me that in chat, I would appreciate it.
Okay, right. That's
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're both pretty high risk here, right? Not knowing what the implications are of not having a good ECG reading or scan. But, you know, just on the surface, I agree with everyone. Emily Kemper, you're right on track there with the B. I agree. So I got another follow-up question for you. So how might you train, or do you need to train or oversee these service providers? What do you think? How might you oversee these service providers? Julia, again, credentials, calibrations of the equipment, SOP from the service providers. Julia, you are right on track. It feels like you must have read R3 because these are some good examples. Thank you for sharing. And then Sylvia, ensure they use a certified equipment. That's right on the money, right on the money. And you might just set up some quality checks, right? So for example, you know, if you set up clear expectations for when you expect the drug or, you know, let's say provider B, for when you expect for the IP to be delivered to the pharmacy at the site, do they deliver on time, right? Are there delays? Is the product delivered and are there temperature issues? So maybe set up some controls so you'll know if it's right, you know, give yourselves a fighting chance, right? So some of the things that you're probably already using in your practice, but how can you extend those so that you can use those same methods, those same mechanisms for overseeing your service providers? So great examples for those of you who shared. Thank you. So let's move on to informed consent. I don't really feel like there were key changes. I think some of the practices that we've experienced, particularly through COVID, have been clarified. And I think, yeah, I'll just stop at that. So some of the key changes, practical, participant-centered, and risk-based. So let me just stop here. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm saying participant. I'm not saying patient. I'm trying not to. It's a change. I'm not saying subject. R3, they've shifted the language. So it's no longer subject or patient and volunteer. They're called participants as described in R3. So that's another change that you'll notice as well. Not a big change, but it's a change for some of you. So how does this affect your site? So sites can use electronic methods such as text, video, and e-signatures while ensuring compliance. So perhaps, and I would imagine, many of you are already using these methods back from when we were implementing clinical trials during COVID. But now it's described in R3. R2 was silent, and it felt like in R2, they tried to not go in too deep when you were talking about digital solutions, right? They lightly touched on it in the context of a consent, but very lightly. So here it's all out. You can use electronic methods. The site should track protocol changes when there's new safety data and legal age milestones to determine if a reconsent may be needed. Now, this is interesting to me. So I kind of grouped several different contexts here into one bullet, but this is interesting to me because as we are considering reconsenting, it's always in collaboration with your sponsor, right? In partnership. So keep that in mind too. This isn't intended to be in isolation, but we know who's responsible for what. But these are just some of the examples where you may need to consider reconsenting. So one of the things that's called out in R3 related to the second part of the second bullet, legal age milestones. If you have someone that's going to be becoming of age, so turning 18 or 21, depending on where you live, during the study, they become of legal age. What are the reconsenting expectations that now you have an adult and no longer an adolescent or a child in the study? So that's spoken to in R3. The site should have procedures to confirm the identity during the consent process, whether it's remote or in person. Sites need a process for tracking and engaging participants who withdraw and discontinue. So how are you going to manage their treatment if they withdraw or discontinue? Right? Is it they're going to just stop abruptly, or are you going to help them manage that, right? Do you have a process for that? And the same for their data. You know, how do you manage that? Sites should plan for providing trial results and treatment information after study completion. I don't feel that that's new. So things to consider as a starting point as you're assessing your current practices and procedures. Excuse me. What steps does your site take to verify the identity during the consent process? How does your site ensure compliance when using electronic consent methods? So compliance, the way that this is intended is compliance. So is there security? Can you check, can you determine who had access to the consent? Who performed the consent? Is the consenting documentation stored in a secure way so that we can verify that the signature was provided by the person who said they provided it? What processes are in place to track reconsent if there's a need? How does your site document and follow up with participants who may withdraw or discontinue? And what is your site's plan, or do you have a plan or a process or tools or procedures for providing trial results and treatment information after the study? Again, just some examples of how you might, things to think about as you're assessing your current practices or maybe missing practices. Oh, we don't have this today. We need to get something in place. Or we have part of it, but we don't have all of it. So another section, section 4, data governance. So risk-based data oversight, tracking, and retention. This is what data governance is all about. So lots to say on this. So again, this isn't only for the investigator site, it's a joint responsibility as described in R3 for the investigator sites as well as the sponsors. So the investigators must oversee all data handling, including from service providers. This is how it's described. Sites must track and document data corrections to ensure compliance. Electronic records must be validated, secure, and accessible. Risk-based assessment is conducted of the electronic systems used by the sites that contain source records. So that'll be a part of the qualification process if it's not already. User access to study data must be reviewed and limited to necessary personnel. Who's reviewing this? To make sure that only the credentialed or identified individuals at your site are actually accessing and reviewing any information related to study data. Sites need clear processes to handle participant withdrawals and data retention. So how might you go about assessing where you are today with these and the many other requirements that are described in R3? So questions you might ask yourself. How does your site ensure that the study data is complete and accurate before submission? Who's accountable for that? Well, we know overall the investigator is. But has this been delegated to someone? How do they do that? And if I were to audit your site or to come in and to do an assessment, and I ask you to prove it, what would you show to me? What would you show me? What processes does your site have in place for tracking corrections in your study records? You know, in the paper days, when I was a CRA and a monitor and working at those investigator sites, it was strike through, initial, and date, right? That was our mantra. What does that look like in your electronic systems? Who at your site is responsible for monitoring and controlling access to study records? Whose job is that? Who gives access to say, okay, you've got a unique ID, now reset your password. I've sent you what you need. How does your site prepare for audits and ensure that all essential records are available? Right, so the site that I was just at a couple of weeks ago, as a part of the inspection, something was lost in translation. They had files stored off-site at a storage facility. For some reason, they didn't quite understand that they needed to get those files to the center for review during the inspection. That was a huge misunderstanding. What steps does your site take to securely store and retain participant data for the required period, even when it's archived? Right? So some questions, just a starting point that you might ask yourself. So data governance in action. So the goal is to make sure your study data is accurate, secure, and complete from the life cycle, from collection through final reporting, so that it's accurate, secure, and complete. Well, how do you do that? It's maybe tracking the documents, understanding who accesses the documents, the information, who's reviewing it, who's making changes, and ensuring that all the data remains accurate and retrievable. Well, it sounds good in theory, but how do you put that into practice? Well, let's take a look, and I've given you some examples here. So, for example, protecting participant information. What does that look like? So it's ensuring only authorized staff have access to the electronic records using unique logins. Sounds like a no-brainer until I show up at a site and I see a Post-it note on the board with the login ID and the password. That's not exactly what we'd intended. So checking the sponsor-provided data for accuracy, that might be in action, reviewing the lab results in EDC before making your decisions, right? About maybe it's increasing the dose, changing the course of therapy, or the procedures to be conducted. Another task might be tracking data transfers between systems. So verifying that the data in the EHR, as it's transferred or transmitted to the EDC, that the transmission is accurate, including the metadata. And metadata is that understanding, that background data that describes who recorded the data, when and where and how. So making sure that all of your threes, they're still threes when they get to the EDC, and that we can tell that Susan entered the data. Oh yes, but Dr. Jones, he accessed the data on this date and he made a change. So maintaining the audit trails, a record of who documented and accessed and maybe changed information when needed. So that's kind of the data that supports the audit trails. That metadata is what supports the audit trails. So it might be in the form of tracking who first entered the vital signs, who later modified them if they did, and why was that change made. Keeping essential records organized and retrievable. So these are just some examples of what you might do. Ensuring that the site files, including your regulatory files, are complete and accessible for monitoring visits, audits, inspections, what have you. Just that's a part of your habit, right? Inspection readiness at all times. Using timestamps to confirm data accuracy. So checking that the informed consent was signed before the study procedures were performed. Prove it. How can you prove that to me? Ensuring proper handling of blinded data. Another aspect of data governance, protecting treatment assignments in the source documents and the investigator site files. Do you have a mechanism or a method to do that? So only assigned, unblinded individuals can see that information. We don't want accidents. So I have another activity for you. It's a quick one. So here we have, all trial activities must be documented in detail, regardless of their impact on participant safety or data reliability. So I'll say it again. All trial activities must be documented in detail, regardless of their impact on participant safety or data reliability. So I want you to tell me, based on what we discussed so far today, do you think this is a right statement, it's correct, or do you think we need to rewrite it? What do you think? If you want to quickly share with me your thoughts in chat, I would appreciate it. And just tell me, do we need to rewrite, or is it right as it is? What do you think? And you don't have to do, I don't want you to write anything to make it right. I just want to hear, do you think it's right? Or do we need to rewrite? So Paula thinks it's right. Julia, it should include reassessments of the trial agreements to ensure it's kept up to date. Maybe that was from the previous question. No, I can't tell. How about some of the others of you? Do you think it's right, or do we need to rewrite? Rewrite, says Ravana. I hope I got that right. Ravana Navarro. Susmita, rewrite. You got it. Right. So Susmita, I would like for you to come off mute and tell me why you think we need to rewrite this. Why is this not right? Help us. Susmita, can you come off mute?
Leslie,
Yes.
I think rewrite based on during the trial execution, sometimes we know that there is a changes in the processes or activities between the site and the sponsor. So at that time, based on the ICS GCP guidelines, sometimes we have to rewrite the trial activities.
Right, right. That's a good understanding. But here I want you to focus on something really critical. Number one, for me, it's always a trigger, right? Whenever I see all, right? That's my first signal. Something's not right here. But remember, R3 was designed so that we, as the end users and the implementers, could use risk-based approach. And we're trying to get away from that one size fits all and leverage our understanding of the impact to participant safety and data reliability. So if there's a high impact on participant safety and data reliability, yeah, you probably do want to document all of the activities in excruciating detail. But if it's related to, maybe an example might be, you want to do a blood pressure retest, right? So you've already done the blood pressure on the participant once, and you got a number, and it looked okay, but you just want to double check. So you redo the blood pressure. Now this is just on a regular study, not cardiovascular, right? Standard of care. We just want to double check. Do I get something similar? It's not high, but I just want to make sure, right? So it's not a cardiovascular, and based on the outcome and the design and so on factors related to the study, this second blood pressure check is probably not going to have an impact on participant safety data reliability. I'm just double checking, right? So that's an activity where maybe based on your institution or your site procedures, you maybe wouldn't record the second pressure, right? Second reading. Depends on what the number is, depends on what the protocol expectations are. It's a lot of depends. So it's not a one size fits all. It really takes critical thinking to think about what are the procedures at my site? What are the expectations, outcomes, endpoints for the clinical trial to determine what needs to be documented in detail versus we can take a risk-based approach. Does that help? I hope it helps. Can I get a thumbs up if that helps as an example of where you're going to have to, apply critical thinking? It's not going to be a one size fits all. Okay. Okay, so we're nearly done. So another area that I wanted to focus on as well is for R3 is end of participation and post-trial activities. So that risk-based data handling, participant autonomy, and transparency. So here it says, sites determine, how does this affect the sites? So sites determine how to handle already collected data from withdrawn participants in ways that aligns with the participants' rights, regulatory requirements, and study reliability. And of course, with input from your sponsor, if you're not the sponsor, right? How are you going to handle that data that's already collected from withdrawn participants? And maybe they withdraw from the study, but you can still use their data. Maybe they revoke your permission to use the data. Do you have processes and systems set up for that? Investigators should discuss participant concerns about withdrawal without applying undue pressure, ensuring the participants' decisions remain voluntary, right out of R3. Sites should have a plan for sharing trial results and treatment details with the participants when applicable. Okay, how do you do that? Do you have a process, or is this just, standard practice of what we do every time? Another aspect that may affect your sites. Sites confirm whether post-trial medical care responsibilities exist, right? Is some follow-up care needed? And ensure that that information is communicated clearly to the participants. Do they need to have follow-up with their own medical practitioner? Or is it they need to slowly do some type of treatment, right? It just depends. But do you have processes, or is that a part of your processes at your site to make sure that participants have that understanding? And is it documented? Because we all know, what do you learn in 101 clinical trial training? If you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So some of the questions you might ask yourself: how does your site, or how does my site, ensure proper handling of collected data from withdrawn patients? Do you know that? What processes do we have in place to discuss withdrawal without undue influence? How do you communicate the results and treatment details to the participant? Are the post-trial care responsibilities, are they defined and communicated? How does your site document and track the participant withdrawal decisions? Is it just early termination? Is there something in the source files? Is there something in the patient records? What have you? How is that documented? And is it consistent? Just some things to think about. So I've shared with you some ideas and thoughts of, high level, some of the guidelines that affect primarily investigator sites. But how do you translate the rules to reality? How do you take action? So let's start with ER. You start with reviewing where you are. Look at your current processes, your current procedures, your current tools. What's missing? Or do you have it covered? Or do you need to beef it up a bit? So that means you're going to identify those gaps and those areas for improvement. So review and then evaluate, and then you're going to adapt. You're going to customize your processes or update those procedures, create a procedure. And then you are going to lead the charge, take the action to ensure sustainability. Because we're looking for consistency, right? That's why we're doing this, to ensure that we have consistent processes that will enable the oversight of our participants their rights, safety, and well-being, as well as the reliability of the data. So the real change, it really starts with you all being proactive, embracing the change with confidence. Talk to one another. You've all got so many collective, I don't even know how many years of experiences that will help you understand how do we go about implementing this? Because I can tell you, we're all still in conversation and trying to interpret what we're reading. I'm going to be myself presenting at ACRP along with the some of the authors of R3. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. So this is not black and white, and it's not going to be a one size fits all. There's not going to be a handbook that tells you how to go from step 1, step 2, step 3. It's going to require critical thinking and collaboration, right? Collaboration is key. You are the front line of integrity, and let's make an impact. So I'll conclude here with, I'm Leslie Sam, and I thank you all for joining me today and hearing what I had to say about transforming these rules into action. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over so we can entertain questions. Thank you. Debbie?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leslie. I really appreciate that. We did have a question in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and let Kylie ask that.
Yeah, we just had a quick question from Julia towards the beginning of the session. It says, just to clarify, the investigator provides oversight to the service provider instead of the sponsor?
Yes, it depends on what the activity is. So this is where it's going to take a collaboration, right? Because we've all probably heard or experienced where the sponsor hires the healthcare nurses, right? The home health services providers. And the sponsor made the decision on who was going to be used, but then the investigator side is responsible for the duties. So this is where it's going to need to be some collaboration and partnership and understanding. Like, I need to have a voice. Is it the investigator side that I want to be able to pick and choose because I want qualified people working at my site that I can trust, right? Is that how the conversation needs to go? If I'm going to be accountable for their performance, I need to have a say in who they are, right? So it's going to be, I think, maybe a little bit differently because this all kind of started during the COVID times, right? We were kind of under the gun. So participants' care wasn't interrupted, but now we're not. So we need to be more thoughtful about it. So it really, to answer your question, it kind of just depends on if the investigator hires them directly, the service provider directly, then yes, the investigator would be responsible for oversight. If the sponsor hires them, in some circumstances, depending on the services that are provided, yes, the investigator may be responsible for oversight.
Great, thank you.
Of course. Thanks for the
Okay.
question.
I'm sorry, this is Shelley Welch. Can I ask a kind of a follow-up question to that?
Of course.
And so if you're contracted with a pharma company for the trial and it's ongoing and it already spells out the responsibilities in that contract and it lies with the sponsor typically, now that we have new regulations, if you will, what's your advice on that conversation with the sponsor?
So a couple of things. So first off, depending on who the regulatory authority is that's overseeing, your particular clinical trial, when this particular guideline R3 goes into effect will be different, right? EMA in Europe, they've said July, like third week of July, it becomes effective. FDA hasn't set a date yet. And
Okay.
I don't, so there's that to consider. But if you're working under an existing contract, you will still want to have understanding. Right? I just like the inspection that I was just sharing a little bit about with the tidbits. This was for a study that was conducted 15 years ago, that was being inspected, that started 15 years ago, right? So just think of all the transformations and all the differences of how we conduct clinical trials compared to 15 years ago, right? But the inspectors, they still expected accountability to some degree, to today's quality standards, right? They were looking for audit trails. Well, back 15 years ago, we didn't have such a good handle on audit trails, but they expected something to show that they had grown and improved, right? So just because it wasn't in place, the regulations or the guidance wasn't in place at the time the contract was signed in your example, well, is it clear today who's accountable for what? And what's the investigator's role in that? Is it clear? I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
I see we have about 3 minutes. Any final questions? And feel free to, you have been muted upon entry, feel free to unmute yourself or place it in the chat, whichever you feel more comfortable with.
I do have one questions on the delegation documentation. Given in the past, what I know that I'm from the sponsor side, and I have noted that we always ask the site to share the delegation log, but I have never seen a situation where the sponsor is sharing the delegation log with the site. So based on this new ICS GCP 6, my question to you is the sponsor is responsible to share their delegation log with the site? Otherwise,
Well,
how the PI would know that which personnel is working on the site, whether they are well trained, whether they have the proper education or credential to perform the trial activities?
great question and great insight. So a couple of things about your question. So first, let's just start with the sponsor is required to have qualified people trained by experience and credentials and what have you on their trial. There is nothing in the requirements that says that the sponsor has to share that with the investigator site, but there's nothing to preclude the sponsor from sharing it. I can't imagine a circumstance where I wouldn't be okay with that, you know, being at a sponsor for over 25 years, I would be completely okay with it. And while I like your question, you bring up another something that I wanted to make sure I shared with all of you. While I think many of you, most, if not, you know, the majority of you are in part of an investigator site or staff team, it's also important that you have clarity and understanding of the entire guideline. So that includes the ethics committee responsibilities, right? Because there are some changes there. Absolutely, and new sections, as well as the sponsor responsibilities. So it'll behoove you to understand, well, what exactly is a sponsor looking at when they come to my site? What exactly is a sponsor looking at when they review the data from my site, right? So I would say it's important for you to understand the investigator responsibilities, but it's equally important for you to understand the responsibilities of the other stakeholders in this ecosystem.
Okay, with that, I know that we are at the top of the hour. Thank you all, everyone from iScore or our Clinical Trials Toolkit series, regular attendees. And thank you so much to Leslie for being with us today and sharing this information.